Hey guys, I'm Jordy, and this is your guide to the giant lobster tennis star and his cadre of tentacle friends, Warlord Zon'Ozz. Now, Zon'Ozz is likely the first big progression wall that you'll face in Dragon Soul, and as such, for guilds with a handful of people that may not be keeping up, you might find you drop to normal the first couple of weeks until you gear up, and that's okay. Hagara, the next boss, is much easier on Heroic, so consider lowering the difficulty if you have to keep on moving through the instance. Alright, so Zon'Ozz is a two-phase fight. The first, you'll be facing down Zon'Ozz himself while juggling a big ball of void energy that you want to bounce around the room between your raiders and the boss himself, juggling it as long as you can. As every time the ball bounces, it will suck up energy, and once it does finally reach the boss, it will increase the damage the boss takes by 5% per bounce. Once he does absorb the ball, he'll run to the center of the room and begin phase 2, where he'll summon a legion of tentacles around the room that will absolutely destroy your raid unless handled quickly and with a plan. More on that later. Alright, so for this fight, we're going to be looking to bring 2 tanks, 6 to 7 healers. We brought 7 for our first kills and it worked great, and a good mix of ranged and melee DPS. One thing to note, the more mages and shadow priests that you can bring, the easier the ball bouncing will be because of dispersion and cauterize. Ideally, you've got 5 total, but it can be done with less with a little planning. Okay, let's get into Zon'Ozz's phase 1 abilities. About 15 seconds into the fight and every 20 seconds thereafter, Zon'Ozz will cast a cone in front of him called Psychic Drain, dealing about 180,000 shadow damage to everybody in front of him and healing himself 10 times the amount of damage done. This should never hit the raid, so you'll look to face the boss away from everybody. Additionally, make sure the boss has a healing reduction debuff up like Mortal Strike or Wound Poison so that you can reduce the healing he does receive. Additionally, 25 seconds into the fight and shortly after each set expires, he'll cast Disrupting Shadows on about 7 players. This dot ticks for about 45,000 shadow damage every 2 seconds. On top of this, if the dot is dispelled, it will knock back any players nearby and deal shadow damage to anybody hit by it. We opt to not dispel this unless in a very specific scenario, so you just need to heal through it. More on that in a second. Okay, now the big mechanic of phase 1, the Void of the Unmaking, or the Void Orb that I mentioned previously. This thing is ridiculously annoying. About 5 seconds into the fight, he'll cast this in front of him, creating a big purple ball that will for a moment be stationary, then will head directly away from him. After about 5 seconds of it moving, it will activate, and anyone that touches it will be hit by 800,000 shadow damage, but this is split by anyone also hit by that same bounce. Each time the ball is bounced, the boss gains a stack of Focused Anger, increasing his physical damage by 20% and attack speed by 5%. Once the ball hits the boss, however, he'll gain a 5% damage taken stack for each bounce that you manage to do, meaning the more bounces that you can manage, the faster the boss will die. Also, for each subsequent bounce, the amount of damage the ball does increases by 20%. Which is still split by whoever it touches, but the damage does ramp up. More on that in a second. One last thing, if the ball reaches the edge of the room, it will explode and the boss will knock up the entire raid, dealing a huge amount of damage and absolutely wiping you. So don't let it do that. Okay, once you've decided enough is enough and you let the void ball reach the boss, he'll eat it and run to the center of the room and begin phase 2. Before we talk about phase 2, let's see how phase 1 works in practice. Alright, so on pull, we'll be looking to face the boss toward the raid, as we want his first ability, the creation of the void ball, to head toward where the raid pulled from. He'll harmlessly create it behind the raid, and from there it will shoot out toward the wall. Now there are a few ways to handle this, but what I'm about to recommend worked for us, and it will work for you. As the raid DPS is the boss, the first ball will shoot out and you'll have a pre-assigned mage or shadow priest in the back of the room ready to bounce the ball by themselves, eating that 800,000 shadow damage to the face. Now, since Mage Cauterize or Shadow Priest Dispersion will prevent them from dying from this, it should bounce right back toward the raid and the boss without anybody dying. Now that's bounce 1. Now the ball reaches the raid, we adjust a bit to make sure it hits everybody, and the raid as a whole soaks it and bounces it back behind them. From here, we've got a second mage who has run out ready to take the ball to the face, bouncing it back. This is bounce 3. Bounce 4 hits the raid, we soak it again, and now a third mage or Shadow Priest is in position ready to do the same thing. We continue this way, and ideally, for this first phase, we bounce it in the back of the room a total of 5 times, or, including the bounces that the raid also does, 9 total bounces. Before we call for the raid to get out and prep for phase 2 as the ball coasts towards the boss and we allow him to eat it. Now, complicating this is that for each of the bounces, the boss is gaining stacks of focused anger. So by the 5th stack, he's got 100% increased damage and 25 increased attack speed. And by the 9th, 180% increased damage and 45% attack speed. The boss will kill your tank here, so the tank needs to manage big cooldowns to stay alive for the last 30 seconds or so of this phase. Now keep in mind, after every time the ball is bounced, it becomes inactive for about 5 seconds. And you can see here, the void ball will pulse once it becomes active again, allowing it to be bounced. The timing on this takes some learning, but if you watch how we do it here, you should be able to manage it. Last thing about this phase, you'll want to watch the timer on the Disrupting Shadows dot that he puts out. It really hurts, and you don't want to go into phase 2 with a bunch of fresh dots out. So we try to time it with the people bouncing in the back of the room so that the final bounce is a few seconds until the second set of dots expire, so that the boss eats the void ball just as that set expires and before a new set goes out. If a new set casts just as he eats the ball, it will likely cause a wipe, as the raid damage in phase 2 coupled with a fresh set of dots on a bunch of people happening concurrently will likely cause people to die and most assuredly a wipe. Okay, so that's phase 1. It takes some time to learn the cadence of the bounces. Your face soakers will likely screw up the timing on the bounces as they're learning and bounce it too early or too late until they figure out the distance required to do it properly. But give it a shot and see if you can line up that 9th bounce properly and then begin phase 2. Alright, phase 2. The void ball is eaten and the boss gets pissed off and runs to the center of the room before summoning a ton of different tentacles. This phase, the first time you do it, will seem impossible, but I promise with some positioning and planning, you can do it. Now there are 3 types of tentacles, all with differing numbers of spawns. There are 4 flails, 8 eyes, and 2 claws. Here's a map of where each tentacle spawns. Alright, what are we looking at? You'll notice the 8 eyes around the room, the 4 flails in the middle, marked by circle, diamond, X, and moon, and then the 2 claws closer to the center. I recommend placing world markers at each of these spots so that your raiders know where they'll be going and which they're assigned to. Okay, so there are 14 tentacles total, and while each individual tentacle is alive, it places a stack of black blood of Gorath on everybody in the raid. This does about 3,200 damage every 2 seconds, but with 14 up, that adds up to a whopping 45,000 damage every 2 seconds to everyone in the raid. However, each time any tentacle dies, a stack will be removed. So the goal here is to quickly kill as many tentacles as you can, because the raid cannot survive at 14 stacks longer than a few seconds. Once the first 6 to 8 tentacles are dead, the raid damage becomes much more manageable. So you'll look to save your big DPS cooldowns here to burst these things down as soon as possible to save your healers. Additionally, each tentacle will cast damaging spells on the raid. Each eye shoots a beam out that can be interrupted, so do your best to silence or kick them, while the flails closer to the center shoot out sludge, which is just something you need to heal through. The big claw tentacles must always have someone in melee range to them, ideally your tanks, or they'll do raid wiping amounts of damage to the raid, so assign your tanks to each one of them. Your main tank will also have to tank the boss for a bit as he becomes active a few seconds into phase 2, but will mostly just melee, and his stacks of focused anger will have reset by now, so it's not too dangerous. Let's get into how this phase works and where to split your raid up so that you can see how it's done. Alright, so if we look at this map again, you'll notice two colored paths, triangle and square. We assign most of the melee and some hunters to square, with a few healers and most of the ranged DPS and some healers to triangle. These groups will first turn and blast the flails. We assign a couple DPS on them each, killing them as soon as possible before turning to the eye tentacles at the edge of the room and taking them out. It's important to stay clumped up in each of your groups here to help your healers keep the raid up with healing rain, splash shields, and whatever they have, as the raid damage is insane. Additionally, using big raid cooldowns here like Trank, Barrier, Divine Hymn, anything to keep the raid alive during the onslaught of damage from the dot and the various tentacles attacking the raid. Okay, so the 4 flails die. The tanks are on each of the claws, and the DPS are now beginning to move around the room in their assigned directions, staying together and taking out each eye tentacle that they can. Ideally, within 15 seconds, you've got the first half of the tentacles dead, the 4 flails and a few eye tentacles, cutting the damage in half, and then using the next 30 seconds or so to clean up the far away ones. Once the eye tentacles are dead, the raid should look to clean up the claw tentacles that they're close to, and then return to the boss as phase 1 begins again and the fight repeats. This phase is tough, but with proper positioning, cooldown management from both each player and the healers, and a little luck, it's possible to get through it without losing anybody. Alright, so we finish phase 2 and begin back on the boss. This time in phase 1, as the raid is a bit gassed after a tough phase 2, we'll only look to bounce the ball 7 total times, using 4 people to take the ball to the face instead of 5 we did in the first phase, and then let the boss eat the void ball again. The fight will continue like this. Week 1, it is possible to only do 2 total phase 2s and then juggle the ball as long as you can before starting a final phase 2 and choosing to ignore the tentacles and just nuke the boss, but we also cleared it doing 3 phase 2s total and then burning him. Look at your raid's DPS and make the call. Stacking on the boss during phase 2 and blasting him while the tanks are on the claws and just using giant healing cooldowns to stay up does work, but it's tough. Consider making the call if the boss is sub 50% after your second phase 2, calling for less then and then burning him down quick. If you manage to pull all of this off, congratulations, he is a tough fight and a strong promise of what's to come in the rest of Dragon Soul. Alright, let's talk about some tank tips. This fight is all about positioning and cooldown management. Make sure after the void ball is being made, you flip the boss around and then start to look at the boss's stacks of focused anger. After 4, you'll need to begin to roll cooldowns. Paladin Sack, Pain Sup, IBF, Shield Wall, whatever, to keep yourself up. We've seen him one-shot a tank, so keep a cooldown running and avoid that. And then during phase 2, you'll need to quickly pick up your claw tentacle and the main tank will need to grab the boss. The healers will be super busy, so the off tank should roll cooldowns here at the start of the phase, and the main tank do your best to stay alive while the healers have their hands full. Also, if it looks like the boss might eat the orb too quickly, you can move him away from the ball's path to give it a few extra seconds to activate. Just play around with it and make sure that you don't face him towards the raid. And for the healers, this fight is insane. Good luck. Phase 1 isn't too bad, but phase 2 absolutely trucks, so do everything you can to keep the raid up in this window. Big cooldowns early will save lives, but also watch your own HP. Things like health stones, binding heal, whatever you need to do to keep yourself up while also the raid is huge. And try to stick with the DPS that you're assigned to, as the splash shields you're putting out also needs to hit you. And for the DPS, especially the soakers, get to know the cadence of the bouncing. If you bounce it too early, it might hit the boss before it's active, and if you bounce it too late, you might delay it too much so that a fresh set of dots go out right as you want phase 2 to begin. I understand this is a tall order, but I know you can do it. And as phase 2 begins, pop whatever defensives you have yourself to help your healers out. Feint, IBF, health stones, whatever, to keep yourself up as you move around the room and take out the tentacles. Another small thing that might help you, you can cleave off the boss who is taking extra damage onto one of the claw tentacles. It's a small optimization, but it is pretty great. Okay, well that's Warlord Zon'Ozz. It's not an easy fight, early in the tier, but I do expect with some gear and tank set bonuses, you'll find it a fair bit easier pretty quickly. If you enjoyed this guide, do me a huge favor and like and subscribe. It helps me a ton in growing the channel, and I super appreciate it. And that's it for me. Thank you a bunch, and I will see you in the next one.